Up on the building! It's Spider-Woman!
And this is Jessica Drew, dedicated to fighting evil while weaving her web of justice. It's Spider-Woman.
Comic books, comics, comic book podcasts, comic books.
I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Mike White.
And this is We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones.
That's right. And as always, you can check us out on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook at Boneless Comics Podcast and on Twitter at Boneless Comics 1 or directly on anchor.fm/Boneless Comics Podcast.
Yep. And you can also check us out on our official website at bonelesscomicspodcast.wordpress.com. It has links to all of our episodes, after shows, additional information on us, your hosts, additional information on each episode, as well as a page where you can now donate directly to the podcast.
That's something that we've talked about for a while, the donation idea and doing some kind of monetization. What we don't really want to do is be in a position where we are reading off ads that are completely irrelevant to the topic we're talking about to you guys. And we also didn't really want to lock people into some kind of a monthly donation system. So if you want to donate money, the link is available on the WordPress site. If not, it's certainly not required, but that's just something that we have out there as an option. And I think that's maybe where we're going to stop the commercialization of it for right now anyway.
Yep. Sounds good to me.
So today we're going to be talking about Spider-Woman Origin, which is written by Brian Michael Bendis, penciled, inked, and colored by Jonathan Luna, with layouts by Joshua Luna. And yes, those two are brothers. So this is Spider-Woman Jessica Drew, not Gwen Stacy, who we talked about last week. And this is going to be in Marvel's primary continuity. So this is not an alternate universe version of the character. But Joe, if you wanted to start us off with giving us some background on where you first encountered Jessica Drew, and then I will talk about that as well.
It's an interesting question. I have to really go back and think a little bit about where I saw her and where exactly I started to actually get into reading about her as a character. And whatever version that we end up talking about, whether in our own personal experiences or even in this podcast, just know going in that the character has a long history of retcons and a lot of different writers. So there's different iterations out there, and so your favorite iteration might be different than ours. But to answer your question, my introduction was more of like a side character. You know, I'd seen her in Avengers stories and other things that I was reading at the time, but I didn't really start to think, wow, this is a cool character, until I was actually reading about her as a side character with Carol Danvers' Captain Marvel. So in these team ups that they would have, they're both like snarky, witty, funny, and it was just like really fun to read the dynamic that they had between those two characters. And I was like, you know, Spider-Woman, she doesn't really seem like a spider-related character. Like I've read Spider-Verse and, you know, Spider-Man, all kinds of stuff, but Spider-Woman's not really a part of that. So it was from there that I wanted to learn more and figure out, you know, who exactly is this character.
Yeah, so I know actually exactly where I first read about Jessica Drew, and that was in the pages of New Avengers, which is also by Bendis. So the Avengers Disassembled book that we reviewed first, that led directly into the New Avengers title, and Spider-Woman was one of the core members of that team. So that was the first place that I really encountered Jessica Drew. And I think that that run played up her subtle suggestion powers, or her ability to kind of influence minds. And it also played up her snarkiness and her attitude, which is definitely something that Bendis is known for as a writer. He co-created Jessica Jones with Michael Gaydos. And so that's another character that is very much in that vein of having that sarcastic attitude and that kind of snark, and always cracking wise, but it's maybe not coming from a place of being jovial. She's kind of a character that's caught between a lot of extremes, and she really has trouble dealing with really who she is and finding what her place is in life. There also was a controversy in the early 2000s involving Frank Cho drawing an extremely seductive pose of Spider-Woman on a variant cover. He was blasted in the media for this. For better or worse, that's really what Frank Cho is known for. He draws really full-figured, not necessarily plus-size women, but kind of a thicker build of woman, but he tends to draw them in very seductive poses. So there was a big controversy specifically over a cover that he drew with Jessica Drew. So I remember that, and I remember really her as, again, just kind of a team character in one of those big Avengers titles.
Well, and wasn't that pose not just a seductive pose, but wasn't it also like anatomically incorrect? Like
It wasn't possible. Yeah.
She would have to break her spine or something in order to pose in the way that he drew her.
It's those spider contortions that Peter Parker does. So maybe she can do that too. I don't know.
Well, and Deadpool can do those contortions as well, because he actually can break his spine and then just fix it later.
Well, just so everybody out there knows that's not familiar with Jessica Drew, she cannot do that.
No. So you mentioned that this was written by Brian Michael Bendis, and that is absolutely true. We have also we have also talked about Brian Michael Bendis before. So if you want to hear more about him, go back and listen to our review of Avengers Disassembled, where we talk about his snappy dialogue and that more mature themes are part of his storytelling. He's into crime dramas, spy thrillers, secret organizations, and the like. So this story is really no exception to that. So for more, go back to that episode. Otherwise, we're going to roll right into the artists.
Yeah, so this is a little bit of an interesting case because we have a brother duo, Jonathan and Joshua Luna. And it looks like Jonathan Luna does most of the heavy lifting for the art, except that he doesn't do the layouts in this title. So pretty much the storyboarding and, all of the positioning of the characters, where the camera was going to be on the shots, those type of things, and sort of the rough draft of all the art would have been done by Joshua Luna, while the coloring, the penciling, the inking was all done by Jonathan Luna. And this is really their only mainstream work at the big two that I'm aware of. They have worked on Red Sonja, which is, I believe, owned by Dynamite Entertainment now. Marvel used to have that character as part of their Conan the Barbarian license, back in the day, but that's gone to other comic book publishers now, so they no longer have that. But other than that, these two have pretty much worked on creator-owned stuff. There's a book called The Sword. There's a book called Ultra and Girls. All of those things, from what I could dig up, looks like they went through Image or other independent publishers. So they really don't prefer to do the mainstream superhero work. So this is kind of outside of their normal area of expertise. Although they did say that they would like to work on Superman, Supergirl, Batman, and Spider-Man, which I read that and thought, okay, so you want to work on all of the really big guns at the big two, basically.
Well, of course.
Yeah. I mean, that's everybody wants to work on Batman. Everybody wants to work on Spider-Man. That's really all I looked up as far as their work history. There really wasn't a whole lot to it. If I'm going to analyze the art itself, though, in this book, I think that the layouts were fine. Camera positioning, all those things, fine. Although the expressions on the people's faces almost always looked concerned. And so if we're going to look at somebody else in comics that does something kind of similar, Rob Liefeld has been accused of always having his characters look angry. This is kind of like that, except that everybody always looked worried in almost every panel. And even in panels where it's not really appropriate for the character to be feeling that way, there are a lot of times where the dialogue doesn't seem to match up with the expression on the people's faces. And I looked at it for a long time, and really what I ended up feeling was that I think that the changes in their expression based on their emotions are so subtle as to be almost imperceptible. And so that makes a lot of the faces look very samey. And that really detracted from the story for me, where I felt like they just weren't communicating the emotions of the characters very well through their expressions. And it really just kind of pulled it down for me. This is something that I feel like was scripted really, really tightly. And I think that there were plenty of opportunities for them to show emotion and push that a little bit further. But the art was really almost simplistic and flat. And honestly, it kind of reminded me of a Flash comic or like a web comic as far as how it looked. The coloring as well, which was done by, again, Jonathan Luna, the same guy that did the penciling, it really was just barely stepping into that world of doing computer rendering for coloring, but it wasn't very detailed, I guess is the best way I can describe it. And it left everything looking kind of flat. And so I was a little bit disappointed by that as well.
Yeah, I definitely noticed in this one, out of everything that we've reviewed so far on this podcast, that the art was really bland, and everybody, yeah, like you said, sort of looked angry, or they all had the same sort of face, and they all had this like mouth shape that when they were upset, you would see that mouth shape everywhere, and it just everybody sort of blended together. And it's funny because I was thinking like they spent maybe not enough time putting detail into their faces, but they did a little too much time putting detail into the female form with her outfits that are very skin tight. And, we talked about that controversial cover, and that just seems to be a thing with this character in particular, is that's kind of how you draw her, is that she has this incredibly tight spandex outfit that really reveals her form. And I'm like, okay, this seems a little bit old fashioned to do this in a comic from the early 2000s. This is a retelling. We're going to fix her origin going forward. So why not put a stop to all that controversy and let's start and take her a little more seriously. So I was disappointed with the art in this one.
Yeah, the art really didn't push the story in a direction that helped it at all. I think it was fine. I think it was serviceable, and it did the job of telling the story, but I certainly would have gone with somebody else. But I will say, as far as the kind of the over sexualization of her character, that's something that Steve McNiven did when drawing her in New Avengers. That's something that David Finch did when he drew her. Frank Cho, everybody that's really been associated with this character around this time, that just seems to be what they were doing. So I don't know if that was a mandate from editorial, if that was just the choice they were making, but yeah, that's very much something that's associated with Spider-Woman.
Yeah.
So.
Well, so that gives you a little bit of background on the book. I do want to give us a little bit of background on the character before we get into the actual story. So, as I said before, her origin is full of many retcons. She made her first appearance in 1977 in Marvel Spotlight number 32, where she was established as Spider-Woman for the simple fact that Marvel wanted to stop rivals from publishing a female riff on their hugely successful Spider-Man character. So she was invented just to fill a role, which is not really great, but she became popular, and that's why we have her today. So despite that, she was still a really interesting character. So her origin is very convoluted, full of many retcons. Like I said, we'll probably get into more detail in this into the after show, but just as a little brief, she's first established as a spider that is evolved by Wyndham, who's a character in this story, into human form with spider powers. And that was immediately retconned because they realized it was a crazy and weird idea.
Even in the 70s, they were like, maybe that's a little too out there.
Yeah. So later they say that she contracted uranium poisoning as a child, spent several years being cured by her father, and this was done in a hibernation chamber where she later emerged with spider powers. And then according to this version, she actually was born in 1924, but being in the chamber decelerated the aging process, so she was still a teenager when she emerged instead of being, like 53 years old in 1977. So
right.
They still tried to keep a little bit of strangeness to her origin. I don't know why we needed that additional fact if they just wanted to impress people with saying, hey, there's a character older than Captain America out there, or what. But
well, I mean, this is definitely a hard sci-fi story, and we're going to get into that once we get into issue 1, but the science fiction element is very pronounced in this. I think that Bendis goes to much greater lengths to explain why she has the power she has and why she is who she is than, for instance, what we had gotten with Peter Parker up to this point.
Right. Yeah, so this origin's a little bit different than that, and we'll get into our review section of whether we think that's better or not and what we like and dislike about it. But for Jessica Drew herself, she has superhuman strength, speed, stamina, agility, and reflexes. She's similar to Spider-Man in that she heals more rapidly than a normal human, and she can attach herself to surfaces and climb on walls. However, unlike Spider-Man, she emits bioelectrical venom blasts and emits pheromones that can both attract and repel people.
Yeah, so they don't really get into that in this title. They show the venom blasts, but I feel like there are instances where she's using the pheromone power, but they don't explain that or really mention it in detail. I think if there's one aspect of her powers that was underrepresented in this story, that's what it was. But
Yeah.
we can get into once we actually start talking about the issues. There's a couple places where I feel like they were in play, but it was very subtle, and Bendis didn't call attention to it.
Yeah, and it's one of those with all the different writers and retcons that, again, whatever version that you read or whatever issues or storyline you're checking out, she may have different powers, and that may or may not line up with something before or after. So it's different, maybe each run. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's that's just kind of a mark of a lot of characters that are I don't want to say lower tier, but not as prominent in the public consciousness, is that very often you'll get a new writer that goes, I'm going to reinvent this character and make them modern. And from what I know, Bendis's take on her is probably the one that's stuck, just because his influence at Marvel over the last 2 decades is extremely large. So I would imagine that this is mostly what we're going with from now on, but I don't know enough about modern Marvel to really speak to that. So
Yeah. Well, and after this, at some point she's gonna be in probably the Spider-Verse animated sequel, and she may or may not get a live action adaptation someday. So it'll be interesting to see what bits from which part of which origin that they draw from and what power she ends up with in the TV and film arenas.
right. So anyway, Spider-Woman origin. Just to get into the beginning of it, one thing that I was hit with right up front that I had totally forgotten about, or that never really tracked with me before, is that she's British and that her parents are British, and they're working for what we at least think at the time is the British government. So I'm not sure why I never noticed that before, but that was a detail that was brought up in the story, and then some of their manner of speech and things of that nature kind of highlighted that a little bit more.
You mean you didn't hear her accent come through
Yeah,
when you were
well,
reading?
obviously the accent isn't noticeable just by reading dialogue bubbles, but pretty much the major players that we're going to be introduced to right away are her parents, who are Jonathan Drew and Miriam Drew, and they're researchers that are working on spiders, of all things, and they're using some sort of DNA combiner or compiler, I think that's the word that they use, to try and splice animal traits into humans. And so that's the incredibly ill-advised research that they're involved in. And it's all funded by Herbert Wyndham, who, if you know your Marvel Comics continuity, is the High Evolutionary. And basically his deal is combining animal DNA with humans or evolving consciousness into animals. I'm not really sure why that's the thing that he likes to do, but that's just kind of what he's about. So they don't really explain him at length early on in this story, but there's a couple panels where they show him in more of his supervillain getup, and you go, oh, okay, yeah, this guy is the High Evolutionary, because that didn't necessarily track with me right away. So one thing that is highlighted really quickly by Bendis is that Miriam is more caring and more worried about her daughter, and Jonathan is a little bit colder, and he's more concerned with getting his research correct. So they've got all this military funding that's come from the British government, and the pressure's on for them to deliver results, with this research. So Wyndham comes to check up on them to kind of see where they're at, and there's an accident that happens very early on where the DNA compiler fires directly into Miriam Drew's womb. And so it's explained that the compiler is meant to coat the interior of the subject with whatever DNA is loaded into it. In this case, a Wundagore widow, which is a fictional spider that they came up with for this story. Wundagore being the mountain or the location that Wyndham lives at. So Jessica is basically baked by this DNA compiler in the womb, and that's the explanation for how she's going to end up with spider powers once she's born.
That's interesting to note, or at least for myself in my personal notes, that you say Wundagore. I was saying it as Wundagore.
Oh, interesting.
I was thinking of it like a British thing, like, oh, Wundagore.
You know, Wundagore is probably how it's pronounced. I believe that's what they'd be saying over there in the UK.
All right, let's not offend anybody.
Okay. Well, you know, I don't even know if I'm doing an accent from the north or the south, or if that's Cockney, or, you know, I have no idea. So anybody out there that speaks actual British English, I do apologize.
Hey, let us know on Twitter what you think.
Yes, please, you know, before we go on in the story, please engage us in some manner. Tell us that we suck. Tell us that you like the show. Tell us that it's boring, you know, anything in between. But please get on social media and engage somewhat. It would really be great to get some kind of dialogue going. So Twitter is somewhere that I would like to see maybe a little more engagement happen, but you can post on Instagram. Right now, people are mainly DMing me, but I would actually like to get some more open conversation going if that's something that everybody's interested in. So yeah, please tell us if we make a mistake, we get the British accent wrong, anything like that. Okay, so rant over about the social media engagement. But pretty much after she gets hit with this ray, she's eventually born. You can see how the stress of this experience is moving the father further and further away. He believes the baby's going to die. And so he gets more ingrained in the research and paying less and less attention to Miriam. Miriam believes the baby's going to live. And of course, Jessica is born and she's just fine. But there are some early indications when she's a child that she might have some abilities. And I don't know if they specifically say this in the story, but is the definition of a mutant within Marvel Comics that you are born with powers? Because I was thinking there might actually be an argument here for Jessica is a mutant, because she actually is born with, you know, superhuman abilities. And that's usually where they draw the line within Marvel. Although I do understand that this is due to an accident and not due to, you know, something that was just in her genetics already.
Right. Yeah, I believe that it's if you're born with powers. So it's a mutation, whether it's something biological, chemical, or just artificial in this manner. Her cells are mutated and she's born with these powers. So I would think she falls under the category of a mutant. And I think there's actually some Hydra agents or somebody who she's fighting that says, look out, it's a mutant or something.
It's in the club. It's in the club later. She displays powers in front of people and somebody goes, oh no, a mutant, or, you know, something like that.
I would think she would fall into that camp more, but I think since she's not in any of the X-Men books, then that's really the determining factor for whether.
Right. Yeah, you've got to be in the X-Men titles to be a mutant, I guess.
It's funny though, because the experiments that they were doing reminded me of this mutagenic recombinator from the 1990 Spider-Man animated series. And basically it was kind of similar. Like it zaps this spider and makes it radioactive, and then it bites Peter Parker, who's attending a demonstration, you know, to see what it's going to do. And so the lizard is actually using this device to try to turn the whole city into lizards. So he's trying to rewrite people's DNA.
As one does.
Well, and that's funny too, because that's not something the lizard actually does. That sounds more like God from DC. But anyway.
Yeah, it does.
So it's just kind of interesting, like with these fanciful technologies where it's basically some sort of ray, or, you know, you could even talk about gamma rays, I think, in the same way, where you're trying to alter somebody's DNA to create, and this even goes back to super soldiers, right? So they're trying to use technology now and science to create this way that they have a fancy laser beam that will basically turn somebody into a super soldier. And so
I honestly want to say they go to way too many lengths to try and explain the science and how the compiler is combining DNA traits and all of that. And I think maybe less is more there. I think Bendis gives us a little bit too much information about it, because the more in detail you go into that ray and how it works, the less believable it becomes, in my opinion. So I think maybe if they just had one or two lines of dialogue that they were like, this is its function, and they didn't get into the nitty gritty of the science, that might have actually been better. I think that, Star Trek is able to pull that off because they have actual science consultants on staff, and so they can usually make things sound at least plausible. But the more that Jonathan Drew was explaining this device to General Wyndham, the more I was just going like, is that really what it does? Okay.
Yeah, it made the first issue kind of drag a little bit, and really wanted to get into like, yeah, okay, I know about the parents and the science and all that. Like, I want to see more of the character and less about the taking notes and making comments and that sort of
Right.
thing. But at least he wasn't, zapping spiders and being like, "Oh, subject appears to be in pain," and "Oh, subject appears," like in our last review with Patton Parnell.
Yeah, and Patton Parnell was our least favorite last episode. Yeah. So, yeah, okay, well, he may not be a serial killer, but Jonathan Drew is still a creep, because he starts giving injections to Jessica once he realizes she has powers, and he becomes obsessed with getting his research to work. Miles Warren leaves the project. A lot of other people leave the project. You kind of get the impression that it's down to just this one guy doing research on the DNA compiler, and he becomes so cold and distant that he doesn't really care about Jessica. He just cares about taking samples from her and giving her injections to see what happens, so they could maybe reproduce the powers that she has, which at this point are not even cataloged. And what this really reminded me of, and it's totally different situation, but I don't know why this popped into my mind. But there's a mother poisoning her daughter in The Sixth Sense, and of course, in that movie, the ghost comes afterwards to tell the father through Haley Joel Osment that she was killed by her mother. But it's kind of a similar scene where you've got the daughter taking quote unquote medication that's making her sick. And yeah, that was really dark. That was a really dark turn for this story to take. I mean, I know that there have been news stories where things like this have really happened. So that was a pretty disturbing chapter here. And it actually culminates in a domestic violence incident between Jonathan and Miriam, where Jonathan is actually trying to choke Miriam. And the only reason that she doesn't get killed right there is because Jessica accidentally uses her venom blast and knocks out both Jonathan and Miriam. Although we do think that they're dead at that point in the story.
Yeah. So. I'm not sure why they decided to go, or why Bendis decided to go so dark with this, because I don't believe in the original that her father was this cold and mean and just interested in science. Like, he totally just deflects any question related to the mother or the child or anything really in life. He's just grounded in his science and his research. And it was just, I don't know, seemed like a little too much that we didn't need, that didn't add to the story.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there could have been a way to play him more sympathetic and still have this story play out the way that it does. Maybe make him an unwilling agent of Hydra or something like that. For those that haven't read it, once we move into issue 2, we find out that Wyndham is working for Hydra. All this research was basically being done for Hydra, not the British government, and so on and so forth. So, but I think there would have been a way to play Jonathan where he wasn't such a cold, basically just obsessed with his work guy. I mean, he's kind of like Reed Richards if you pulled his heart out and he was just about the research. Because Reed Richards comes across as cold a lot in the comics, but he always has that heart where he cares about his family. And Sue is able to pull him back, and her influence, kind of keeps him where he never removes himself completely from society. But Jonathan Drew here is just like, I don't give a crap about anyone. I'm going to get this research done, and I'm going to prove to everybody that I'm right about my theories.
Yeah, nothing seems to phase him or snap him back into reality or make him exhibit really any sympathy for anyone living.
Right. Yeah, so he's, I don't know, for better or worse, that's the direction they took it. But yeah, it's a pretty dark opening to this story. And things don't really go uphill for Jessica after that, because she wakes up, what is it, 10 years later? So she was 7 years old
Yep.
when that happened. She venom blasted her parents, and she wakes up and Wyndham is there, and he's basically like, yeah, you've been in a coma for 10 years, and we're Hydra. We're the good guys. We're fighting back against the evil corporations that are trying to use their wealth and influence to take over the world. And, we're going to train you to use these incredible powers to basically fight back against the quote unquote bad guys. So she wakes up to mental conditioning almost immediately. And there's another kind of Marvel minor villain here, Mentallo, that he employs to indoctrinate her and plant false memories in her head that her parents have been killed.
At first, I thought Metallo. That's the wrong universe. And then
Well, I thought Mento, who is a character in Doom Patrol at DC.
Mentos, like the mints.
Mento, just drop the S, just Mento.
Well,
yeah.
And then he sort of looks like Magneto, so then I was even more confused.
Yeah, he's not somebody that I really knew about. I mean, I had to look him up on the Marvel Wiki to know who Mentallo was. So anybody, sound off in the comments if we're not pronouncing his name right, or something like that. I think his name's Marvin Flum, something like that. They mostly address him by his civilian name. This basically takes us into the part of the story where Jessica is forced through mental and physical conditioning to become a Hydra agent. So, for better or worse, this is her life now. And that includes a love interest, Jared, that is, he's a true believer in Hydra, but he's basically been put up to the task of kind of making her stay more comfortable and bending her to the Hydra agenda. And honestly, she's a 17-year-old with the mind of a 7-year-old. So it's kind of gross that he's kissing her and stuff.
It could only be Jared.
Yeah, I mean that's that's absolutely the vibe that we get from him.
Yeah, but the story starts to pick up here and get more interesting, and I think really sets her up as a more unique character because she started on the dark side, and eventually later we'll see that she goes to the light side, to borrow a reference from yet another Disney property. But it gives her these additional layers that she's had all of this secret agent training and fighting and all of these skills that she's learning from a young age, mentally even younger.
Right.
But she's got all of this training that she brings with her. So it's not like she discovered her superpowers one day or anything like that. It's like she's almost been bred as a weapon, kind of more similar to like a Black Widow type character.
Yeah. That's a parallel that I hadn't thought of, but that's a pretty good parallel.
In the Ultimate Universe, I think they actually make her a Black Widow.
Oh, really? Okay. I haven't read far enough to encounter Jessica Drew in any of the Ultimate.
Yeah,
stuff.
I haven't either. It was just something that I kind of stumbled upon. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I might have to look that up later.
Yeah. I did think it was interesting, Hydra's platform of basically the corporations and the rich and powerful are abusing everybody. I mean, all of that stuff is true. That's stuff that's happening in our society right now. And we, it seems like it's becoming more and more prevalent. They of course are representative of those elite. They have usually an authoritarian agenda or a fascist agenda, or whatever you want to, however you want to spin that. They're modern day Nazis, and anybody that's seen the movies, any of the Avengers movies, Hydra's all over it. So
yeah,
so this is obviously
the bad guys.
Yeah, this is a very bad place for her to be, and but it is interesting to see it from that side and how what they're presenting her and what you're presented with in this story, even right up front, they look like a very good organization. Like, oh yeah, that seems like a worthy goal. So it's not until Jared gets captured and she has to go rescue him from a shield base that things start to take a turn for Jessica, and she starts to question, maybe is Hydra not the way to go. So once we get into, I think it's around issue 3 that she's going after Jared to rescue him, and this is when Shield gets involved, and of course they're the mostly benign intelligence organization at this point that deals with superhumans in the Marvel universe, and Nick Fury is their leader. Now, this is not the Samuel L. Jackson Nick Fury that you know from the movies. This is more the Kurt Russell TV movie version of Nick Fury.
That's a good way to describe it.
It's down to his way of speaking is even kind of an older time. You know, he says Mama Fury's little boy didn't come down here for nothing. And he has some of those kind of older Stan Lee quips that you would hear in the 1960s dialogue of some of these comic books. So it's very funny to see him in this modern early 2000s setting kind of spouting off this dated dialogue, but I think there's something kind of charming about it as well. But he's the one that shows Jessica footage, not before she takes out an entire team of SHIELD agents. He shows her footage of Jared blowing up a city block in Morocco. And, he's like, look, Hydra are terrorists. Here's a terrorist attack. This is what they're involved in. And he shows her the video evidence. And she's like, no, Jared would never do that. But afterwards, they basically have footage of him screaming, Hail Hydra, this will send a message to the world about our power. Cut off one head and 2 more shall grow in its place. And so it becomes clear very quickly that Jared's been misrepresenting himself to Jess.
Yeah, he's got that angry mouth going on while he's yelling all these things about Hydra. It's funny, too, because like going back to Nick Fury, he's really kind of like that crotchety old guy personality where he's just gruff and rough around the edges. And I think if this weren't more of like a PG comic, he would swear like a sailor.
Yeah,
is kind of how I imagine his
that would
character.
be very appropriate for him.
But so at one point he asks somebody by the name of Agent Carter to bring him a Dr. Pepper. So if you've read any Agent Carter comics, you've seen the Netflix show, you'll understand how insulting this would be to a Carter with their history of being independent women, of being agents, and not being somebody who brings you Dr. Pepper. It's just...
Yeah, it was a little bit demeaning to have him ordering around. I don't know specifically when this takes place in the comics, but Sharon was pregnant. I can't remember if it was Captain America's baby or not, but there was somewhere around this time period that was going on. But she was also going on all these insane intelligence gathering missions with Cap all the time, and she was basically his regular love interest. So yeah, to reduce her to basically an intern that he's like, go grab me a soda is pretty crappy.
Yeah, I don't know why they specifically picked Carter to be the one that he said that to, but they did. That
really rubbed me the wrong way too.
Yeah. So, and then it continues as he's going through his exposition about Jess's life up to this point and how she's been duped by Hydra and this wonderful Jared guy that she's been smooching. He compares her dad to the maker of penicillin for achieving his best results by accident, and then ends his presentation with Jess being compared to a fish in a tank to be kept alive so it can be studied short of being dissected. So if she wasn't traumatized before she met Fury, she definitely is now.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches when he's talking to her. He's basically like, here's the gruesome truth about what they were trying to do to you. They were slicing up your mind. They were taking samples from you. They were, doing all this stuff. And to me, especially knowing, us as the audience, knowing where her character is at this point, it's like, holy crap, you're asking this character to grow up in like 2 seconds. And to her credit, Fury kind of dangles the information that her parents might still be alive in front of her, and she flips sides really quickly. And maybe part of that is the shock of learning all this about Hydra and what they were trying to do, but I felt like she flipped loyalties really quickly, and I also felt like the writing switched very quickly from she's a child in a woman's body to, okay, she's an adult now and she just understands all this really quickly. I mean, there wasn't a lot of passage of time there. It felt like for her to really process all that was going on. And again, it's only a 5-issue mini, so maybe that was what they did just to keep the pacing up. But I felt like we needed a little more story connective tissue there, maybe some kind of time lapse montage to explain how suddenly she's intelligent enough to understand all this that Fury is telling her. I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's weird because with all of the Hydra brainwashing and everything, she does sort of come out of it quickly. And I get that her parents are a trigger for her. Like I don't think that she necessarily switches loyalties, but she, because she grabs Fury and says, "Where are my parents? You lying expletives."
Yeah.
But at the same time, she's quick to, see that footage of Jared and go, "Oh, I guess Hydra's the bad guys. Okay, well, now I'm neutral. Well, I'm going to side with you Shield guys just so I can find my parents." Like, well, wait, you're going to, you don't think these people are lying to you. You're not going to go through this whole thing of denying it or being a triple, quadruple, whatever agent that we would be up to until this point. Like, you're not going to play one side and just, what's her angle? It just, and maybe that's just her being immature as she kind of just goes along with whoever she's with and whatever they're telling her and presenting it as the truth. Maybe she's just really that naive.
Yeah, I guess that's possible. I guess that's one way to kind of explain it away that makes sense. Is that her mental development would maybe leave her just susceptible to just whoever's in the room is going to be able to convince her of their point of view. But
Yeah.
but yeah, she does flip really quickly, and I kind of had the question of like, does she really have any reason to believe Nick Fury over General Wyndham?
I
You
would
know,
think the brainwashing would be too strong for that. Even with the,
yeah,
evidence, she'd be like, well, that's clearly fake.
right, right. There's no questioning the video evidence or anything like that. But one thing that she does say throughout the story that I actually really relate to is that she's constantly saying, "I just want to be left alone," and you do get the sense that this really sets up where I know her character to be, which is she's constantly got this divided loyalty of Shield's got her spying on Hydra and Hydra's got her spying on Shield. And later in the comics, the Avengers have her spying on Shield and Hydra when they think Shield has gone rotten and they don't know if they can believe them. And she's always kind of caught in this place where she doesn't know where her loyalties lie and everybody has her sort of lying for them. And I think that makes it hard for her to nail down really what she actually believes or where her loyalties actually do lie. Because she's constantly caught between these warring intelligence organizations. I think that she wants to do right, and I think ultimately in this comic she would be on Shield's side, and in New Avengers, I would say that she's probably actually on the Avengers side, at least up until Civil War, which is a whole nother ball of wax. But
Mm-hmm.
it really does come through in this story how trapped she is, and I do kind of identify with the idea of like, could everybody just leave me alone and let me live my life? That's something that I certainly want. Maybe as an introvert, but also somebody that just feels that they've had a lot of expectations on them from various directions throughout the years. So that made her very relatable to me.
Stop telling me what to do, how to feel, what to think.
Right.
Just give me a chance because she doesn't really get to grow up on her own, so
No.
she doesn't get to go through that independence establishing phase. And well, I guess she does in this story when she says leave me alone and tries to get away from everybody. But
Right. So she is able to track down her mother after Fury kind of drops the huge bomb of information on her. Unfortunately, when she does, the Iron Man villain Whiplash murders her mother pretty much as soon as she gets there. So, her venom blast or her suggestion powers or any of that stuff aren't really enough to stop that from happening. And that really ends pretty darkly because Jess goes from this to basically killing all the Hydra agents and blowing up the airplane that they were on at this point. So again, we're taking a little bit darker turn with this character than what I would have expected. She's not the person that's going in there and making sure that nobody gets killed.
right, she's angry, she's confused, she's been brainwashed by the bad guys, and that makes for a deadly combination.
Well, and she's also, I think this is very firmly, even though she wears a bright red and yellow costume, this is very firmly in kind of like a Black Ops or Spec Ops type genre, which again, this is what Bendis really likes to write about. He likes spies, he likes that whole world. And so all this kind of international espionage and, we've got to stop this mad scientist from doing something overseas, and we've got spies coming after him and the warring organizations. That's all stuff that Bendis is really, really in love with. So, and spies kill. That's just a reality. So we do see her kill a couple times throughout this comic book, but it doesn't necessarily make me sympathize less with her. I just feel like she's a woman that's been maneuvered into a place where she doesn't really have a lot of options. She hasn't been able to grow up. She hasn't been able to establish her independence, and she's trying to just get through this situation the best that she can.
Yeah, so after that, she goes and looks for her father and then meets up with him, and he's not warming, welcoming. He's just cold. He's focused on his research, his notes, and she tells him that her mother is dead, and he goes, "Frankly, I'm amazed she lasted as long as she did. Your mother made her own decisions, and she paid the price." Ouch, talk about cold.
Yeah, that's really, like, you can tell that he's gone from, he doesn't have one iota of caring left in him.
No.
Fury had said earlier in the story that maybe they didn't know they were working for Hydra, maybe they were naive, but at least at this point in the story, Jonathan Drew knows firmly that he's working for Hydra, and he's basically like, I don't really care, who I'm working for, as long as they let me do my research. So
Yeah.
I did have a question about this though. When she remembers her father in her memories, she sees him as a werewolf killing her mother, and they also show her caretaker Bova as an actual bovine, a cow. I know that the High Evolutionary evolves animals to have human-like intelligence, and that's kind of like his deal. Is that what they're referencing, or why was that? That was very confusing to me. Why
So
that was there?
I'm not sure about the werewolf part, other than maybe it was just because it was something scary, or if there is actually something to it. But I do know that Bova is actually one of the new men that the High Evolutionary created, and is actually the bovine nanny for Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, aka
Oh,
Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. So there's a whole story that involves them, and they actually travel to Wundagore, and a few things happen there with them. And there's actually in the WandaVision Netflix show, episode 2, there's a brand of milk at the grocery store Wanda's at called Bova milk. So that character actually has references outside of this and previous to this, but I'm not sure about the werewolf.
I mean, she was Jessica Drew's nanny, and she was Wanda and Pietro Maximoff's nanny.
Well,
That's interesting.
maybe she was Jessica's nanny. I mean, how much of that was implanted by Hydra and changed and manipulated
Yeah,
by Mentalo? We don't know.
yeah, that's true. I mean, the first issue, I would say, is probably the way events actually played out, but the story calls some of it into question. So it is a little bit hard to get a bead on exactly what went down there. What we do know for sure is that she was conditioned by Hydra, to be this agent for them after whatever went down with her parents. So
Yeah, I kind of wish they would have played that up more, like what's real and what's not real. That was neat
mhm.
in like the Mr. Miracle that we read before, where you get to the end and you're like, okay, what parts of this are true and what parts aren't, and what parts were in their mind, and that would have, I think, been a more neat element for this to liven it up a little bit,
Mhm.
as well as some of the humor that just didn't land. Like Jess makes a joke early on about telling Captain America he can't have bright colored uniforms, and then Hydra guards are talking and they're like, "No, Madam Hydra won't sleep with you," and the other one says, "But I clean my uniform." Like it just, there weren't that many of them, and they seem so out of place in this dark story, and it didn't help. It detracted from it. Like I don't know. I think some of the more mind game elements would have been better to have in those panels than these goofy comments.
Yeah, some of the humor is overtly sexist, and So this is interesting because I was thinking about this the other day. I think that Brian Michael Bendis as a writer has grown up with us, whereas where I don't think you're going to find much of this kind of thing in his writing now. Whereas that was very much, we had the Hawkeye wants to sleep with Madam Hydra joke in the beginning of Avengers Disassembled, and this has him saying stuff. It feels like just to be edgy, claiming that some of the sort of clones or experiments that he created that were like Jessica, one of them had a sexual relationship with her father. Again, those things, I don't think Bendis would write those into a story now. I think that he has progressed and matured some since this point. I don't know why this came to my mind, but I think Joss Whedon is somebody who he had that sense of humor when he was writing Buffy in the 90s, and I don't think he has grown up since then. I think that he's still doing that.
Yeah.
And I don't want to steer this completely off track, but a lot of the jokes that didn't land with me are the moments that just really left a bad taste in my mouth in Joss Whedon's cut of Justice League were those kind of sexist remarks where it would be a joke that I'm just like, ooh, like that's not something we say in 2016, 2017.
It's not funny anymore.
Yeah. I mean, there's stuff that we've just kind of progressed as a society, and there are some things that we realize, okay, maybe that's not a great thing to be joking about because there are people out there that are actually abused and stuff like that. So I don't know that this was a necessary element for this story, but in defense of Bendis, as I've read more of his modern stuff, I don't think this is something that he does anymore. So, make of that what you will.
Yeah, it could just be he wasn't sure how to interject humor, so he used something cliche. And
right.
In more modern stories or current stories, he's able to tell actual jokes that are funny. It's kind of like the cheap scares in horror movies, right? So somebody
Sure.
jumps out of a closet and everybody goes, "Ah!" And then after a while, you're like, okay, can we actually have something scary instead of
right? You have the score will do the work for you too sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Where you're not even showing anything scary, the score will just it'll give you that jump. Again, the humor didn't really land with me pretty much 100% of the time through the book because it was all kind of that stuff, and that it didn't add anything for us to know that one of her father's experiments had a sexual relationship with him. But we don't really have time to think about that too much because Madam Hydra comes in and kills Jonathan Drew. So at this point in the story, Jessica has now lost both of her parents, whom she originally thought, were dead, found out they weren't, and then, we're back to, oh, they're dead again. But Fury comes in at the end to pick her up, and I was almost sad that this happened because I thought, after everything that Jessica's been through, with her parents, with her being conditioned by a spy organization, with her having to, kind of figure out what her place in the world is. Is she loyal to S.H.I.E.L.D.? Is she loyal to herself? Is she loyal to Hydra? It really sucks that S.H.I.E.L.D. comes in at the end to basically be like, you're a really valuable asset. You were able to hide from us really effectively, and we've never seen anybody do that. So we should start working with you. And you almost get the sense that she doesn't really have much of a choice. So it's got that kind of morally gray ending where, Jessica is going to work for the quote unquote good guys, but I almost get the sense that she would be happier if she could just be a solo superhero and not have to be part of some spy organization. So, for better or worse, that's where we end the story. And she does name drop the West Coast Avengers or make a reference to they need superheroes in the West. And I was assuming that she was on that team at some point, that's why she said that, but I don't really know, to be honest. Yeah, so Joe, do you want to tell me what you thought of this in Bananas? Because I've been having a hard time the entire time. I would like to hear your take on it first, and then maybe we'll see where I land.
I'm going to play a reversal card, and I think you should go first because I think my review is really going to skew you in one direction.
Okay.
And I'd be interested to hear where you are where you're coming from.
So my thoughts on Spider-Woman origin are that this was a really good origin story. And this established firm rules for Jessica, for the universe that she lives in. It gave us an idea of how trapped she is and really the kind of character that she is. And I also think that it felt like she had her own sort of universe around her of character and setting. It also felt like she was firmly a part of the Marvel universe and like she had always been a part of the Marvel universe. It didn't feel like this was something that was forced in there as a retcon, even though I know this story is a retcon. So I think it was really successful on that level. There were some pacing issues. Some of the humor didn't land for me, and the art ultimately was not something that I enjoyed. So those are all going to be things that hold it back. But I do really like how it shows that Jessica is kind of this person that's caught between several extremes, and she's just trying to, figure out how to navigate that. And honestly, she has to be very mentally strong to be able to take all of these, warring intelligence organizations and all of that stuff happening to her at the same time. So I think I'm going to give this a 3.5. I'm deducting a whole point just because I would hesitate to say that I hated the art, but I really didn't like it. I really didn't think that it helped the story in any way. And it was competent in telling the story, but yeah, I'm going to take off a whole point for that. The other 0.5 is just really the pacing being so slow at the beginning, and then Bendis's humor just not landing for me and not quite, I don't know, just being kind of immature. So yeah, 3.5 bananas for me.
That's kind of what I thought you were going to go with. Just with us talking and everything and going back and forth, it sounded like you enjoyed a lot of things, but there were also a lot of elements that you would deduct points for and kind of end up in the middle. And that's why I didn't want to go first, because, and I can't believe I'm doing this and being this critical in general, let alone on anything that has the spider prefix, but I'm actually going to give this a 2 out of 5 bananas.
Wow. Okay.
And so a lot of the gripes that you mentioned, there's just so many of them. Like the art, this being Brian Michael Bendis, like maybe, well, it's been like what?
He's been at Marvel probably 5 years at least at this point, I would say.
So he's been at Marvel for a little while. He's worked on Ultimate Comics. He later creates Miles Morales as a character. Like he's done all these great things, and I really do like reading his work. But for this to be a representation of his work, I would have thought this was written by somebody else. Like it doesn't have a lot of substance for me. The humor wasn't the only thing that didn't land. Like the story, like we just took so much time establishing her dad as this cold-hearted guy who didn't care about his family, and then we just kill him off later, and there's no like emotional repercussions for her. Like what's she thinking, what's she feeling? Is she going and hiding and crying and having a meltdown? Like we don't take her through any of the we get a little bit of combat training that she does with the Taskmaster, and then she goes toe to toe with him later, which yeah, okay, sure. Him being able to photocopy anyone that he sees being a very formidable ability, but also for somebody that he trained, like I don't think that she learned how to be that unpredictable that quickly that she could go toe to toe with him. So there's just so many elements of that in here where I felt like we missed emotional moments, we missed times to put more substance into the story, like her training, her background, her brainwashing, and this being a story where you're taking a character that's been retconned and rewritten so many times. This is your chance to establish her as an A-list character going forward. And I felt like they dropped the ball.
Right.
And, maybe 5 issues was too short. Maybe it wasn't, and they just didn't put enough into it. But for a story post-2000, for a character that has this really interesting backstory with all the super spy stuff, like, don't confuse her with Black Widow. Don't make her Natasha Romanoff. Make her her own version of, the spy thing with the powers and everything. But I just felt like they just really dropped the ball on this and didn't live up to what it could have been.
I can definitely see that, especially from your point of view, especially wanting Bendis to take her and really bring her to the top of the mountaintop where she belongs as an important character. within the Marvel Universe. And I think Jessica Drew is an important character within the Marvel Universe. I like her a lot. I did want to add something that occurred to me while I was reading, and they never explicitly state this. But anytime she takes down Taskmaster, or S.H.I.E.L.D. can't find her, or even earlier on when she's a child and she's handling the incredibly dangerous spider, I'm assuming that her pheromone powers are at play, influencing the minds of people around her. And that's why she couldn't be tracked. That's why Taskmaster was defeated by her, all of those things, but they don't explicitly state it. And that's a big problem. In fact, that's the power that I think gets little to no explanation in this story. But oddly enough, that's the power that we see her use the most in her New Avengers run. I know there's a scene where she's fighting almost the entire Wrecking Crew, which these guys are like Thor villains. And she manages to use her pheromones to basically reduce one of them to just a blubbering idiot. He's crying about how horrible his life is by the time she's done with it. And there's really none of that, or them showing how powerful that ability is. So that was kind of a misfire for me as well. I think you could talk me down to a 3 maybe, but honestly, my initial take on it is probably about a 3.5. I couldn't give this as high as a 4 because it's just got too many misfires. But I think maybe I thought it was structured narratively a little bit better than maybe you did. But again, that's why we're doing this. This is interesting though, because this has been our biggest difference of opinion on anything so far.
Yeah, and just to clarify, this is on these 5 issues. Like Spider-Woman as a character, totally different rating. This is really just this Spider-Woman origin. And, I would compare this to, and let me explain this, but I would compare this to the first, for the review that we did of Hellboy, because that was his first appearance. And there was a lot of stuff that wasn't fleshed out. There was a lot of stuff that kind of, we know he has this stuff later, but they didn't explain it, or it wasn't present, but we know he has it later. And it was his origin, so they didn't have it all developed yet. They were throwing it out there to see where they could go with it. And I rated a little bit higher because it was their first steps. And I think they did a really good job getting that character out there from the beginning. Whereas if this was her actual origin and we had never heard of Jessica Drew before these 5 issues came out, I would probably give this a little higher rating. But the fact that we've had this character since the 70s, we're taking the opportunity to set the record straight from all the history that we've had with this character. I feel like it should have been better, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say. She had been around for so long, and there are a lot of opportunities within her lore already to play with. So, yeah, okay. Well, all right. Joe gives it 2 out of 5 bananas. I give it 3.5 out of 5. And I think that's going to do it for Spider-Woman Origin. Next time on We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones, we're going to go back to DC Comics to talk about Batman The Last Night, which is from 2020. So we're going to be doing a much more modern comic book story this time. And because I am not super interested in sort of vanilla Bruce Wayne comics, this is a radically different post-apocalyptic take on The Dark Knight by the superstar creative team of Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo.
Yep, it should be interesting. Let us know what you think about this episode on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Definitely stay tuned for our after show on YouTube, where we'll go into more detail and talk about this episode, and we will get you later.
Yes, we will. Peace out, and thanks for listening, guys.
Comic books.
Comic books. Comics.
Comic book podcast. Comics.